Welcome back to an episode of Real Conversations about Aging Parents. This is your host, Rebecca Tapia. Thank you so much for being with me here today. I appreciate you joining and spending your time listening. I am going to do the second episode in a 6-part series of what kind of support might an aging parent need. And just to back up, there was a previous episode on who, so not required listening for this episode, but would be helpful. But let me just give a brief description. We've already talked about who would be on the list of people that we might either be currently supporting, obviously, or future support provided. And the way we came up with that list was we looked at people from a sense of affection, -5 to +5, of how you feel about that person or the sort of intrinsic motivation to assist. And then the next component was duty, a 0 to 10 scale of how obligated or motivated you feel, not from a sense of affection or how connected you are to that person, but more of an extrinsic, meaning like cultural, familial, social pressures, or even your own internally developed value system of a duty you feel towards somebody with or without a level of affection. So anyway, there's a whole episode on it. I would encourage you to listen to it at some point. But if you're stepping with me through the series, we're going to talk about, okay, now that you have your list, hopefully that was helpful, we're going to step into really conceptualizing what modes of support that they might need or currently need. Obviously, a lot of people are listening to this that are already knee-deep in helping and supporting somebody. So I am dividing this into 3 buckets. And the 3 buckets are time, touch, and treasure. Hopefully it's easy to remember. So I'm going to call them the T's, okay? These are the 3 T's. Let's talk about the first one and really flesh this out. And the reason we're doing this is now that we have the people in our head that we're going either currently or will provide support for, I want to give the brain a pathway to say, well, what kind of support are we talking about? And remember, as I alluded to in the last podcast, the more neutral we can make this language, the easier it will be for the brain to engage. And what we want to help reduce the overwhelm and anxiety or uncertainty on this topic is for the brain to engage a little bit differently. So again, I apologize for using fairly cold and neutral language, but that is, I think, the best way to set this up. So the first bucket is time, and there's a lot that's captured here, and probably one of the demands that gives people the highest amount of anxiety because most people don't walk around having a ton of time on their hands, especially if they're mid-career, have their own children, etc. I'm going to list out some things that do take time. So things like transportation, taking somebody to and from an appointment, being at the appointment, being present at the appointment, asking questions, etc. Another thing that takes time is what I call case management. And so you might not be a direct caregiver. In fact, I would imagine most people listening are not necessarily a direct one-on-one caregiver, but there's a lot of case management. There's a lot of paperwork. Like for my grandmother, she's obviously not in a condition to sit there and pay bills. So somebody's having to make sure those bills get paid. She's not in a condition to apply for Medicaid, which she's doing right now. There are people, including my mom, that are assisting in the Medicaid application process. There's listening, evaluating, checking on people. If you're involved with their care, it's usually in your best interest to hang around every once in a while and check out what's going on, try to prevent things from happening that are easy to prevent. That may take some time. And then indirect care. So it may be communicating with other people in the family about what's going on. It may be managing a delivery of new equipment. It could be figuring out, okay, the cost of, it depends, diapers just went way up. Like, how are we going to rebudget this? What brand are we going to move to? There's a lot that goes into it, and the time can be highly variable, and it could rapidly increase, especially in times of a medical crisis. Say this is, 30 to 60 minutes a week, and then somebody goes in the hospital, and then it's multiple hours or days per week for that period of time. When things are going okay, there's a set amount of time that's spent, and then you kind of go through these waves of a rapidly increased time and then hopefully settling back out. And as somebody ages, if their health is failing, then you'll see these spikes a lot more towards the end of their life, right? So there's more hospitalizations, lengthier rehab courses, et cetera. And so time, just as the component of the what kind of care, what kind of support is expended is a very practical way to think about it. And if you're currently in a support situation, And by the way, I'm very careful not to say direct caregiving because of what I said earlier. So I'm not trying to leave out the direct caregivers, but I want to also include people that maybe aren't doing the toileting and the bathing, but are expending time and resources to support that person in other ways. So it could take a whole village. It could take a whole team of people to support that person. So time is one of the more pragmatic limitations. And if you've got your life pretty much buttoned up and pretty time tight, and there's not a lot of daylight in between work and management of other things, and that's where a lot of the stressors come in. I imagine there are situations where if somebody had unlimited time, that maybe it wouldn't be so stressful. But if you're looking at somebody, especially if they're still working and have other people they're caring for, they simply don't have as much time. And that kind of feeds into the selection of who might be in the caregiving situation more directly, might be the person who's more flexible with their time. So somebody who's retired. And as we talked about before, works from home, although that's an asterisk because that can be a difficult situation when you're expected to work fully for the hours required, but then also be a full-time caregiver. That's a very difficult situation. But anyway, so the person with some time available, maybe they have lower on the affection scale, but still the time available, that can be a big component. But that to me is the most measurable and pragmatic mode of support to give to somebody else. And it is something that we don't have any control over whatsoever. We can't make the clock go any faster or slower, just is what it is, because no matter what we do, all of our times are limited. And as some may say, we're just sort of a speck in the grand scheme of things. And so whatever time we do have, I think time is one of the most important receipts for your life. I can tell how I'm doing and how I'm feeling by how I'm spending my time. The second one is touch. And this is where I want to capture the direct care for that person. And the reason I keep this bucket in here, even if you are not a direct caregiver or never intend to become a direct caregiver, this is the bucket that is the most time consuming, the most expensive, and the highest risk of burnout or complications. So spending time helping somebody with some paperwork, I think, is very important. But in general, it's finite, right? Non-recurring, hopefully, or manageable, can be kind of done on your own time. You can fit it in your schedule. But for direct caregiving, you have moved to a situation that is not on your personal timetable. Direct caregiving involves being available on very short notice, like I have to go to the bathroom. And if caregiving involves you stopping what you're doing and going to somebody and assisting them to go to the bathroom, then you can imagine that direct caregiving is a different stratosphere, right? Not only is it time, but it's like mega time, okay? Because obviously that person maybe can't control when they have to go to the bathroom or when they have a medical episode. And so this becomes a fairly unpredictable and dominating component, especially if that person is not able to walk to the bathroom. That's the biggest one. If they can get up and walk to the bathroom and they need to go to the bathroom, that solves a good percentage of these kind of time demands. So to me, that's kind of a bridge, right? So once we've crossed that bridge, we're no longer able to walk to the bathroom on our own, then you can imagine that we've gotten into a situation where we need somebody to be available at a moment's notice to do a task that may take 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes. And if you imagine how much old people go to the bathroom, it's a lot. There's a lot of anatomic reasons for that, physiologic reasons for that. And I say old people in jest. I'm becoming an old person. Yeah, they go to the bathroom and sometimes a lot and sometimes very frequently. So direct caregiving has that kind of innate time component. Not only is it a time component, but there's also the unpredictability of it. Now, you might say, okay, we take showers Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We do medications at 7, 12, and 4. You can kind of get some structure to it, although people that do direct caregiving will tell you even that doesn't always work out. Meals are at this time, this time, this time. But depending on the care needs for that person, this can be dominating an entire day. I mean, imagine, and not to infantilize an elder, but you go back to the days where your kids needed a lot of supervision for using the restroom and for getting food. It's not like they can make their own food and so forth. So you can already be familiar with what this looks like, and it kind of flips, and then you're thinking about it from an aging parent or older adult. So when we're talking about direct caregiving, one of the issues that comes up can be really hard to talk about, really embarrassing, and there can be some shame and cultural components to it, is personal hygiene. And I bring this up because this is part of the caregiving process, especially if somebody's living with you. It's when somebody uses a restroom, if they're not able to clean themselves. I know that sounds like cringy to some people listening, but it's true. And there is a question about what kind of care, remember we're in the what side, can be provided and by whom. And there are elders who feel like nobody in the world can help them with that very challenging task except a family member. I would have nobody but a family member help me with that. And then there are people and elders I've met that will have anybody but a family member do that. And so there's this wildly different scale of what kind of care is needed here. And so if that elder is someone who does not want their adult son involved in their bathing or toileting, that's a different support system, right? So what does that mean? Is that a certified nurse assistant? Is that a caretaker? Is that a Pure Wick system, which is how some people might manage urinating in a way that's a little less invasive than, you still have to get cleaned up after the Pure Wick's changed. But anyway, not to get too far in the weeds and not to add some extra stress to this situation. When you really think about the what, and of course you may not know exactly what kind of care is needed, but I'm talking about the direct caregiving part of this, then there's some complications there too. And so you might go back to thinking, well, I'm not on the list to provide direct caregiving to this person, right? And it could be simply because that person doesn't want you to. They don't want you involved with that, right? Or maybe you don't know it, but you're the top of the list, right? You're the person that they're going to call to come out. And I see this so much in the nursing facilities. They don't want the aide that's on that night because of whatever personal characteristics of that particular nurse's aide that's on, and they'll call their daughter or their son and say, I've got to go to the bathroom. You need to drive up here and take me to the bathroom. So sometimes the daughter and son will, sometimes they don't, but that's an instinct. It's like, I don't want anybody else helping me with this. And I've seen the opposite instinct, like I need to be here in this nursing facility, and they'll tell me this because I don't want them taking care of me, right? They want a different relationship. Yeah, so you can kind of go both ways, but personal hygiene is a very important component. So the two kind of bridges to cross here are, can that elder get to the bathroom to and from independently, or maybe with a walker or something like that, and then personal hygiene. So that's what I would throw into the direct caregiving. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to that: cooking, cleaning, laundry, but that's really the sticky points of who and how much direct caregiving is needed. If you are part of a sibling group and you're spending some amount of time helping in that bucket, you're in the first bucket, but you're not in the second bucket, touch, which is direct caregiving, I would encourage you to consider that direct caregiver as somebody who might need some extra support or encouragement. And if you have somebody in a direct caregiving situation that is taking on that role and trying their best, that you become part of their support team, part of their cheerleaders, because that person now becomes part of the ecosystem and a critical part of the ecosystem to support the older adult. They may be the only person in the whole ecosystem that has the time, the back strength, the flexibility, the patience in order to provide what is usually an increasing amount of support over time. And so a lot of the success in these types of situations is built upon how the ecosystem isn't just supporting the person, but supporting the person, and making sure that they're included. And that's where you get things like respite care programs. Depending on insurance and health status, you'll see some situations in which somebody might have some programs can have a caregiver come in, or even the elder admitted into a respite type situation and give some relief to the caregiver. And so not paying attention to the caregiver is like not paying attention to the tread on your tires. Because in a caregiving situation, in my experience, when it blows up very quickly, very badly. And it's kind of like, it's fine until it's not. And so I would encourage you to check the tread. If you're involved in a care ecosystem, help the tread where you can. So yeah, so that's the touch. So we went over time, that's touch. And then the next one is treasure. And I use this to talk about resources. So primarily financial resources, but this could be sharing a home. It could be sharing costs. It could be buying equipment. It could be an expenditure that's not necessarily time related or caregiving related, but some other resource is going to be captured in this bucket. And so when we're talking about caring for an aging parent, particularly if they're going into declining health, usually part of this situation is that the person is not working. They're sort of limited to whatever incomes they've generated in their lifetime. So that would be a pension, a Social Security income. That could be retirement savings, reverse mortgage. I don't know. All those things that could go into forming the amount of financial resources they have to support themselves. And what's difficult is usually they have a fixed amount of financial resources in the climate of increasing costs. And so their care needs may become, especially towards the latter part of this process, more expensive than they're able to afford. Or you can have people like my grandmother who have no assets, and the only money to her name, I believe, is about $1,200 coming in per month with Social Security. And then she uses that to cover her insurance payments, which are a big chunk of that. And then her medication. So by the time she pays for all the different insurances she has and then her medications, frankly, there isn't that much left. So especially at the beginning of the year when the deductible resets, and she usually can't cover the meds easily the first 3 months of the year because all the meds go up to full sticker price until she hits her deductible, and then they kind of calm down after that. So yeah, so especially at $1,200 a month, I mean, you're not really affording much as far as caregiving and so forth. So one of the demands of that on that care ecosystem could be resources. And I've seen some situations where people split these buckets up, right? So one person is kind of the case manager, maybe one sibling is a direct caregiver, and then another sibling maybe lives in another state is like, I'll just send the money, whatever it costs. And that can work as usually if it's set up ahead of time and everybody agrees that that's sort of a good split. What's sticky in my grandmother's situation is the internal debate, not myself, but of how much is informal caregiving worth? Well, and if the ecosystem, and by ecosystem, I mean the person needing or receiving care and then everything around that provides that care, has decided that informal caregiving is going to be reimbursed, you have to think about what it actually costs to buy that on the open market. And you're looking at $25 an hour. And you might think to yourself, no, I can go hire somebody for $7 an hour. Well, maybe in your specific situation and geography, but most of the time, if you're trying to get somebody who's going to do a decent job, maybe 20 is the minimum, $25 an hour. And so once you tell the ecosystem, as I did, you're looking at $200 a day for an 8-hour support, times so many weeks, like that's a lot. So that's $1,000 a week. And then that's $4,000 a month. So if my grandmother makes $1,200 a month and her caregiving, which doesn't include anything else, is $4,000 a month, that's not possible, right? So the system isn't going to produce $2,800 a month. And so if somebody's absorbing the caregiving needs for that person, even if they're as simple as supervision, like being available, you could toggle that down and say, well, I don't believe it costs that much. Okay, $2,000 a month. Still, you had to toggle that way down to match the income of my grandmother. You'd have to pay somebody like $3 an hour to assist, to even have a hope of that fitting in her budget. And so clearly what's happening is if her care needs, which I think would easily cost $4,000 a month on the open market, are being filled by somebody who's not charging anything. And there's been a lot of discussion about this more broadly about just the absorbed costs of indirect caregiving. Then you can imagine that the system, one of the reasons I talked about supporting the person supporting is because that's a cost avoidance in the system of several $1,000s a month. And you can say, well, how I don't really understand that. Well, if I took that same patient and put them in a skilled nursing setting, you'd be looking at a minimum of $4,000 a month for a shared room with somebody else. So that means like a dorm style room with 2 beds and a curtain in between. And so you're not going to get away with any amount of care for somebody who is unable to get up and go to the bathroom and shower themselves less than $4,000 a month. That's how I think about it. That's $50,000 a year almost. And, that's why supporting informal caregiving or unpaid caregiving, or even turning paid caregiving into something else, is important to think about, because you're in a situation where meeting their basic needs. I'm not talking about a fancy nursing facility or retirement home. I'm saying meeting their basic needs has now been, starting at $4,000 a month. And so treasure is a big deal, right? So in some ways you could use your financial quote unquote treasure to purchase care, but there aren't a lot of families that could just sort of cough up $4,000 a month, even with multiple donations over time, to assist in that. And so the best case scenario is that there's the informal caregiving situation and they're doing the cost avoidance of $4,000 a month, but at the expense of the caregiver, right? Maybe they could have been working, maybe they could have been earning X number of dollars per hour, and they're not. And on behalf of, although I'm not included in this group, but having been around this group a lot, I would strongly encourage the recognition and understanding of what that person's actually doing, not only for the elder or aging parent, but for the ecosystem as a whole. And for that sake, the tax system. Keeping somebody at home and out of a nursing facility is saving the federal taxpayer $4,000 a month. And so they're kind of a global benefit to that. So tax revenues are not being expended to keep that person in a nursing facility. And so the benefits are wide-ranging, but the cost is unequally borne by the person doing the direct caregiving. So they, in my head, regardless of how I feel about them personally, rise up to the top. That becomes a key component of the care ecosystem very quickly. And if the ecosystem wants a successful situation, then the ecosystem should support that person to the extent possible. That is probably very preachy, but I mean that from a pragmatic standpoint. They are the tread on the tires. And you might not find out until it's too late that there aren't a lot of tires left. There is nobody else. And you end up in an expensive or Medicaid-based situation. So another thing I want to tackle is some branch points where your treasure could be conserved or expended. And I don't mean you specifically. It could be the treasure of the ecosystem as a whole. But financially, the branch point between choosing traditional Medicare and a managed Medicare plan, initially, there's usually some amount of savings in a managed Medicare plan, maybe a zero copay, zero deductible, zero premium, something like that. And so you kind of grab the initial conservation of treasure or resources. But as we're discovering, is in many cases, you're trading a future amount of money or reducing future care in order to have less payment up front. And obviously, there's a lot of variability in managed Medicare plans. We've talked about them a couple of times on the podcast. I'm not saying that they're evil or not right for everyone, but if I were to think about the couple of branch points where we have some amount of control, one of the key differences between traditional Medicare and managed Medicare is that traditional Medicare has set benefits. And so if somebody goes through a hospital stay and ends up needing a period of rehabilitation, Medicare will automatically give 100 days admission, with the first 20 being copay free. And so that's basically 3 weeks up front without a copay, and then a bigger breathing space than managed Medicare, which tends to give maybe 7 days up front and then harasses you, in some cases, frequently, until that patient gets sent home. And I say this because I'm the person that has to call the insurance company and say, all right, well, you gave us 7 days with this very sick, debilitated person. Can we have 7 more? And then I have to go through their pushback and discuss with them and have these actual conversations that I don't have with traditional Medicare. Traditional Medicare is just a lot more straightforward. So I just want to draw your attention to, there's a lot of things we don't have control over. This may be one of those areas where it may be right for that patient to go back to traditional Medicare and refigure the budget at some point to help support traditional Medicare. The other thing I would say, I've had this conversation over so many different years, so many different people, is they say, oh, don't worry, I don't need to worry about my aging parents. They're independently wealthy. And okay, that's great. I think that's awesome. One, a couple of issues with this. You don't always know that. You can presume some things, but unless the family is very open about their finances, like you go over for Christmas and they're like, hey, look at my bank accounts, their situation could be far better or worse than you perceive. And there's a lot of familial and social and cultural components to how that information is shared or not shared. And so they may think it's none of your business to know anything about their financial situation. And they may think the best thing ever is to tell you all about their financial situation and talk about it openly. But even then, if you think you know, you may not actually know, right? There may be some more money there that they've lost track of, maybe some cognitive issues. There may be less money there. There may be scams. There may be a front provided about how things were going, and then under the hood, things are a lot different. If you perceive that a parent or in-law is independently wealthy and none of this will affect them, you kind of have to go back into the math part of it, which is, okay, if you get into a pretty significant caregiving situation, you're thinking like advanced dementia, and there isn't an informal caregiver willing to give their time and attention or able to give their time and attention to this person, and you're looking at a memory care situation, you're looking at $100,000 to $150,000 a year. So if somebody is developing dementia, but their health is relatively intact, and they have $1 million, that money may only last about 6 to 10 years to help care for that person. So what sounded like independently wealthy, they've got $1 million in the bank, is really 6 years of care. And if that person is 65 years old, that gets them from 65 to 71. The other issue with the caregiving industry is that, it's very inflation prone because they have to have labor costs, housing costs, food costs. And so whatever estimates we have today, you're projecting out 10, 20 years, that money may last even less. And so I think there could be a false sense of security. Obviously, the more money, the easier it is to manage all sorts of issues we've just talked about. The easier it is to purchase caregiving. The easier it is to make sure the housing is the best it can be to support that person. But anyway, so just be careful with the assumption independently wealthy, and just understand at the highest rates of expenditure, that money could last only a matter of a couple of years. When we talk about the treasure of yourself that you're willing or able to support, or the ecosystem as a whole, it can be very complicated. There can be high emotions running. I'm part of lots of different Facebook groups about aging parents. There was recently a post about someone who recently discovered that she had been paying for quite a number of things for her parents, including insurance premiums and medication copays. And then she recently discovered inadvertently that her sibling, who was not participating and supporting, made about $200,000 more per year than she did. And she was completely unaware, and that caused drama and friction and some difficult questions that she was having to tackle. Again, it's not like everybody sits together at Christmas and is like, show me your net worth. I bet there are some families like that. I don't know, probably somewhere like on a boat or something. I don't know. I would not want to be at the Christmas party, but to me, that's not, my family certainly not like that. And even then, net worth is typically something like, home equity, which isn't easily accessible for caregiving needs for someone else. So anyway, so a lot of times it ends up becoming kind of a financial ecosystem of the family. And that's not necessarily that you go and presume that somebody may have money set aside for their kids' college or their future retirement or their future caregiving needs, that somehow that now belongs to the ecosystem and that now belongs to that person. I think that's a highly personal decision. Only you know your financial goals. Only you know your current and future obligations to the extent possible. And yeah, I think that's a very personal discussion and decision that's probably at the family level, like the nuclear family, like you and your spouse, maybe you and your children. And I think that's obviously one of the more sensitive parts of the what. So we talked about time, we talked about touch, which is direct caregiving, and then treasure. So these are the 3 T's. Not that it can be easily predictable, and even those needs are fluid throughout time. But when you go from the who might need support, this is my version of what kind of support is needed. So thank you so much for listening. The next episode is going to be about where. We'll go over things like assisted living, senior living, etc. So I look forward to sharing that with you in the future. Until next time, have a great week. Hey everyone, it's Rebecca. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd like to take just a moment to review the disclaimer. This podcast is for informational and occasional entertainment purposes only. Nothing discussed here is formal medical, legal, or financial advice. By listening to the podcast, we are not creating a patient-doctor relationship between you and myself or any of the guests. Really, it's just me and a possible guest or 2, sometimes 3, sitting around talking about difficult topics related to aging parents. If you have or suspect that you might have a medical problem or condition, you should seek advice from a licensed medical professional. If you have any questions or concerns, please read the full disclaimer in the show notes or contact me directly. Thank you again for joining us today. I can't wait to see you next week. Have a good day.